Hello and welcome. In today's video, we're going to be making a beef stew, and it is a relatively straightforward recipe. Specifically, I'm making one from Jamie Oliver. He called it Jewel's favorite beef stew. It's apparently his wife's favorite version of beef stew. Like I said, it is pretty typical. There's a couple of quirks which I will point out. Let's go ahead and get started. I've got some beautiful sage leaves here, very aromatic. These are going to go in with the onions when we initially start to fry. I'm just gonna set those aside in a bowl. And let's go ahead and get started with our onion. We'll get that out of our way here. There we go. We just need kind of a rough chop here. Don't need them particularly fine. That is one of the nice things about a stew. It's a very comforting food, but it's also very easy to make. We're just gonna chop up a few veg or meat, throw it in a pot with some broth, let it cook for a while, and we are good to go. Put these in my bowl. Other half. Okay, simple as that for our onions. Now let's deal with our parsnips and our carrots. Same general vibe here. We're going to peel them, slice them up, cut them into basically rough chunks. Of course, in a stew, everything's gonna cook down and get tender, be lovely. My peeler. The other thing about a stew is you can put whatever you want into it, what veg you have on hand. If you're not feeling the parsnips, you could put in more carrots, or just omit them. Use what vegetables you have on hand. In the original recipe, he has some Jerusalem artichokes as an optional addition, but anything like you have on hand, of course, could be added as suits your taste. Pretty forgiving dish in that sense. And the last one. Okay. I also have some of these small yellow potatoes, and I'm not going to peel them. The skin doesn't bother me in something like this. Some people do like to peel it off. These are small and can be kind of fussy for doing that anyway, so you could use a larger size yellow potato that you cut up if you do want to peel. I'm gonna cut these in half in a moment, but that's about it. Okay, so let's just trim our carrots here. All those scraps can be used for stock, of course. Myself a bit of a flat edge here. Kind of gonna chunk these up. Peeling, you can kind of get a flat edge sometimes. Roughly the same size, but not being too particular about it. Gonna cook for a nice long time and get soft. And basically the same deal with the parsnips, but I'm gonna split these because they have a pretty woody core quarter them. It's pretty tough. And then we can kind of do, if you're careful, is trim out that kind of woody bit. It's pretty tough and not so nice to eat. Quartering them makes that pretty easy. Gonna chop those up. Let's do the same with this fellow. You really want to try to slice through, not just press. One. Let's grab our potatoes. Like I said, I'm just going to cut these a little bit smaller. These little ones doesn't really matter. Go ahead and set these on my table here, just to make it a little easier. One's a little bigger. Again, not too worried about precision. Everything thing's gonna cook for a long time. If you want everything super precise in your stew, by all means, make it happen. To me, this is definitely a rustic kind of dish, so nothing fancy. Okay, so we've prepped parsnips, potatoes, carrots. They're all gonna get added once they get over to the stove. We've got our onion ready to go. Now basically all we have to worry about is our beef. So let's take care of that now. Alright, so I have here about 1 3/4 pounds of chuck roast. It's good for stewing because it has that fat in among the muscle fibers. That's going to get all unctuous and delicious as it cooks over time. If you get, pre-chopped stew meat, that's going to work just fine. But yeah, something with that nice fat, good for braising is what we're looking for. And I'm just going to quickly chunk this up. Just nice larger size chunks. And I'm not being too particular about it. Okay, so we've got our meat sliced up. We have one more step. I'm gonna wash my hands and we'll finish off the meat and then we can head over to the stove. Okay, so like I said, this is a pretty straightforward beef stew with a quirk or two. And one of those is that in his recipe, he doesn't brown the meat before adding to the stew. Now, I know some of you might be up in arms about that. Certainly a very classical way to do stew is, of course, to brown the meat, and you could argue, hey, you get that extra dimension of flavor from searing the outside of the beef. And I won't argue with you. That is typically how I make stew. But he felt in this recipe this worked better for him, and I am going according to that recipe. I actually am going off the notes I wrote down. I did get rid of that cookbook a number of years ago, but I had written down this recipe from it. So who knows, maybe I've transcribed things poorly too. But I thought about it a little bit, and while it's true, like kind of the typical stew you might think of, we brown the beef first. And as I said, that's usually what I do. There are a lot of dishes that are made without doing a browning step on the meat. I think of like a lot of Asian soups or stews. So I don't think it's that crazy of an idea. Certainly, if that's the way you like it, that is totally fine, and you can make this same recipe just with browned meat versus adding it directly. One thing we are going to do though is put some seasoned flour on the meat. As things cook, this will help thicken up the stew, give it that texture we like. So I'm just gonna put some flour on my plate here, and gonna add some black pepper. I'm gonna give it a good amount, so I like that peppery bite in the stew. This is to taste, as really every recipe is, I could argue. And let's add some salt. And we'll just kind of mix this together. And when making seasoned flour, you want to taste the seasoning. So give it a little taste. Just to make sure you're not getting only flour. This is going to be providing some of our flavor. I think we're pretty good. So I'm just going to add this to the beef and we'll mix it together just to get a real light coating on there, and then we'll be ready to cook. The best way to do this, of course, is with your hands, just to make sure things get coated. Alright, so I have a light coat on this beef. We are all set to go. So let's head to the stove and make our stew. Okay, I have my pot heating on the stove. I'm also preheating the oven to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. We're going to start on the stove and finish in the oven. So I'm going to start by adding some butter and olive oil to my pan, and we'll cook up the onions and sage. Alright, getting that butter melting. And we're going to add our onions. And we're just going to fry those for 3 or 4 minutes maybe, just getting them softened up. And I also have the sage leaves in there with them. It's getting crazy good smelling in the kitchen here. And now we're going to start adding everything else. I added 1 3/4 cups of beef stock to tame things down. I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of tomato puree. And all of our veg. Also going to add a bit more salt and pepper to help get everything seasoned. And we have a last bit of liquid to add. I'm going to add half a bottle of red wine. And we have a big pot full of goodness. This is actually the first time I'm using this beautiful spoon. It was a gift. I'm very excited about it. To break it in. The stew seemed very appropriate. And all we're going to do here is get this up to a boil. Then I'm going to cover it and put it in that warm oven. Hot oven, really. Now, the recipe has you cook this in the 300-degree oven about 3 or 4 hours. I think that's probably a little long. I think probably we'll start checking before 3 hours. Nice thing about a stew in a cut like this is it's hard to overcook it, but it can dry out if you really go way over. But it's very forgiving. But I am going to check to see how things are doing after maybe 2.5 hours. And if it's done, we'll take it out. But the other note is that I first got turned on to simmering in the oven instead of on the stove by Alton Brown. I like that he brings a lot of science to cooking. And well, people have done it that way for a long time, of course, but just pointing out that it's a good way to maintain a constant temperature. Or sometimes you have to work more to keep things at just the right level of simmer on the stove. His recommended procedure, though, is the one I usually use, which is, I think it's about 250-degree oven for the first hour. Then if you're going longer, you can turn it down. Or like 250, 200 for that simmer over time. So I think this 300 degrees, it's kind of a more aggressive simmer. Just keep an eye on things, but I am going to just stick to the recipe. I like to keep things straightforward for what we're doing here. And looks like this is starting to boil, so I'm going to cover it up and I'll switch it to the oven. And then we can put our feet up for about 3 hours or so. We've got that beautiful stew simmering away and time on our hands. And I thought since it's a fairly simple recipe, why not make up a salad to give us some greens to go with it. And I had some kale that I needed to use up. I've just hand torn this, run it through a salad spinner. And we're going to make a very simple dressing for it. I do have to say this comes from the Six Seasons book, which we've done a lot with. But I guess it kind of speaks to how much it is kind of integrated into day-to-day cooking I do. But it is a delicious kale salad. It's just lemon juice, pecorino, salt, pepper, chili flakes, some olive oil. A bunch of very typical ingredients, so nothing too shocking. I won't argue about the provenance of all of this, but pretty typical Italian ingredients. If you're dubious about kale, I still recommend you give this a try because it's delicious. Kale. Well, I've learned to love it. But let's go ahead and get started on the dressing. So, we're going to take the juice from a lemon. There we go. Half a garlic clove. I have a real kind of small clove here. I want to chop this really fine. Microplane grater is actually a great choice for this. Just turn it right into a paste. I'm just going to chop it up fine here really quick. There we go. Let's get that in there. Beautiful. Absolutely love garlic. We want about a 1/4 teaspoon of red pepper flakes. About the same amount of salt. Again, some black pepper. A good glug of olive oil is the official measurement. Right. It's just a basic dressing, some lemon and some oil. And then I'm going to take our pecorino. We'll actually use the handle this time. A 1/4 cup. That's kind of a generous 1/4 cup, but I can run with it. Let's go ahead and get all that in there. Mix it together. really kind of a slurry. I often will microplane both the cheese and the garlic for this. It's a nice, delicious goo. Alright. Like I said, I just kind of hand rip this up to kind of go quickly. The preferred method is take the leaves, roll them up, and slice them very finely. Kale can be tough, kind of breaking it up helps a little bit with that. And then you can also massage it if that is your jam. But the only real way to do this part is mix the dressing up with your hands. Yes, it's messy, but it's the way to go. I'm just gonna dump that in there, and then we're gonna mix it up. You gotta play with your food. Massage that kale, tenderize it, make sure it's nice and relaxed. Get the full ASMR spa treatment. Like I said, messy, but it gets the job done. That is all there is to it. Let me wash off my hands. So pretty simple to make. Everyday type of ingredients. You know, if you're keeping kale and pecorino around. But those are good things to keep around. Very delicious. You can eat it as is. He recommends topping with some breadcrumbs, which is also very nice. And of course, you'll want to give it a taste just to make sure you've got the right balance of items. I think that is pretty delicious as it stands. So I'm going to enjoy some kale salad while the stew is cooking. And we'll be back together shortly. Our stew is getting close to being done. So I'm going to prepare a little garnish. This is something that if you saw my other soup video, I did, like, you just chop up a little bit of herbs with some garlic. It just adds this wonderful splash of flavor on top of what you're making. In this case, Mr. Oliver suggests some lemon zest, rosemary, and some garlic. So we're just gonna go ahead and prep these up so we can add that little burst of flavor to our stew when we serve it, okay? So first things first, I'm just going to get some zest from this lemon. Got my little microplane grater here, make it easy. The lemon will be great for some brightness, pretty rich stew, of course. zest in there. And then we're going to grab some rosemary leaves. Jamie Oliver's style is pretty like bombastic when it comes to herbs. He's very indulgent with them, kind of like a big flavor vibe. I'm not 100% there, so I'm not going to do a bunch of rosemary here. Just a bit. Just going to chop it up. Okay. Put that in with our lemon. And then I just have Mr. Clove of Garlic here we'll chop up. I do love garlic, so I'm not afraid of adding some in. Getting that nicely chopped up. That's a pretty big clove, but I'm not afraid of it. Okay. Alright, so we have just this nice mixture. We can sprinkle some on the top of a bowl of stew. That little extra jolt of flavor. Going to be so delicious. Alright, let's check on the stew. Wow. I have pulled the stew out of the oven. The house smells terrific. So let's serve up a bowl of this stew. Now, I mentioned when I was cooking that I was using a new spoon, a wonderful crafted wooden spoon. Also going to be using a new ladle, new to me. This is quite old. This was actually my great grandmother's soup ladle. You may have seen the chicken noodle soup vid. It was that great grandmother. generously gave me this after that video. I didn't know that we had it. So very special to still have this in the family. That beautiful connection to those who've come before. So I'm going to try it out for the first time as I serve up some of this stew. My gosh, just wonderful. Look at that. Make sure to get a little carrot in there. Some broth. Wow, this looks amazing. And as we prepped our topping, I'm gonna toss a little on there. And oh my goodness, getting the smell from that at the heat popping up. Smells so delicious. Oh my goodness. And I've been waiting to give this a sample. So I've got my spoon here. I've been able to wait. It was about 3 hours, and slightly less maybe. You want all the vegetables to be soft and the meat should come apart pretty easily. Just absolutely terrific what has happened here. Gonna grab a bite here. Delicious. It was a hefty dose of wine, so you definitely get the wine flavor. You could lean a little more stock versus wine if you don't want as much of that, but very flavorful. Appreciate that little extra bit of flavor that comes from that garnish. So, a very delicious beef stew. Jamie Oliver's, Jules' favorite beef stew. And I hope you enjoy. Good night.